You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nasim Ahmed and I will be your host for today's discussion. Earlier this month, over 800 scholars and practitioners of international law, conflict studies, and genocide studies signed a public statement warning of the possibility that genocide is being perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. More warnings have been issued, including by UN officials, who have also resigned, accusing the UN of not doing enough to prevent a genocide in Gaza. And in fact, genocide has become the most common term used to describe the horror unfolding in Gaza. But first, to bring our attention that the horrific crimes being committed in Gaza amounted to a textbook case of genocide is one of the foremost experts on genocide himself, Professor Raz Segal. Raz joins me today to talk about the reasons why he believes Israel is committing the crime of genocide, and also some of the ramifications of that in the months to come. Welcome to the show, Raz. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Raz, as I said, is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockholm University and the endowed professor in the study of modern genocide. So let's begin, Raz, with what you've said, your article and also a number of interviews that you have given, where you argue that Israel's action in Gaza meets the UN definition of genocide. Why do you see the current assault on as crossing the threshold of genocide? What evidence makes it a textbook case, to quote your phrase?
Thank you so much. Just a correction, I teach at Stockton University in Southern New Jersey in the US, not Stockholm University.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I think that what's important to emphasize is when the discussion about whether a case of mass violence qualifies as genocide is a discussion in international law that is based on the only international legal definition of the crime of genocide, which is the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from December 1948. The convention requires, it's a very high bar to prove the crime of genocide because it requires basically a special intent, and in the language of the convention, intent to destroy a group that is defined in national, ethnic, religious, or racial terms. So the intent to destroy a group as such is actually very important because it means that members of the group are targeted because of their group memberships, right? Not as individuals. Intent is very difficult to prove because perpetrators of genocide rarely express themselves in direct, clear, and explicit ways about what they're planning to do. I've argued that this is a textbook case of genocide precisely because we have clear, explicit, and direct proclamations of intent by Israeli state leaders and senior army officers, that is, people with command authority, right? We also have a lot of proclamations of intent by members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. We have a lot of what's called incitement to genocide, which is a separate crime according to the convention in Article 3 that applies in large part to journalists, actually. And we have a lot of that in the Israeli case as well. And of course, the Israeli public sphere and social media and social spaces in Israel today are awash with genocidal and annihilatory language. We can perhaps talk about this more. But what matters for international law is intent that expressed by state leaders and by senior army officers. And here from the very beginning, after 7th of October, after the Hamas attack, we have these proclamations. I do want to say that, and I've said it in all the interviews that I've given so far, and I've written it in everything that I've written about this so far after 7th of October, that I think that the Hamas attack on 7th of October was a horrific war crime, a mass murder of about 1,500 Israelis. It most likely included elements of a crime against humanity as well. If you think about acts of torture, taking of hostages, it's indeed an ongoing crime. If you think about the captives and the hostages, and I think it's very important to be very clear about this. Right? There is no way to excuse or justify this, and international law applies to everyone. And that's why I've also written in my Guardian article on 25th of October that the people who planned this for a long time and the people who perpetrated this need to be put on trial. So it's part of thinking about accountability moving forward. Now, of course, this horrendous and horrific mass murder, which shocked Israelis and people around the world for very good reasons, right, does not then justify or excuse the genocidal assault that Israel launched on Gaza immediately following that. And as I said, the proclamations of intent were very clear. You know, on 9th of October, Israel Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, what has become now very well known and infamous, proclaimed a total siege. So taking a 16-year-old siege on Gaza, which was already a clear violation of international humanitarian law, and included several instances of Israeli attacks on Gaza, and basically intensified it to a total siege, cutting off water, food, medical supplies, fuel, completely. Now, this actually very much falls within one of the acts of genocide in the convention. So once intent is established, and I'll say a bit more about intent in a minute, we have 5 acts that qualify as acts of genocide if we have intent. So killing members of the group, causing serious mental or bodily harm, measures calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, which is the total siege, precisely the total siege, right? And then there's also preventing measures intended to prevent birth in the group, and forcibly kidnapping and removing children from one group to another. So the 3 first acts of killing, of causing serious bodily and mental harm, and the measures calculated to bring about the destruction of a group is very much things that we're seeing here. And again, we can say a bit more about what's actually going on that shows, right, the dynamics of genocidal violence. But back to intent for a minute. So Yoav Gallant's 9th of October total siege was very significant. Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog, in the first days of the Israeli attack on Gaza, said, and I think I can quote him quite accurately, said the whole nation there in Gaza are responsible, right, for the Hamas attack, basically. So taking 2.2 million people, and everyone needs to remember, half of whom are under the age of 18, right, children and youth, and turning them into an enemy population, basically, right? All of them are responsible for the Hamas attack. That's, by the way, as we can see from other cases of genocide that are very well known, like the Armenian genocide or the Rwanda genocide, rendering a whole civilian population as enemies in a time of war, right, is that's very genocidal, right? And we see this in other cases in history. We then also Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who promised early on to turn Gaza into rubble, quote, right, into rubble. Then, in the 29th of October, if I'm not mistaken, on the date when Israel launched its ground invasion into Gaza, referred to the biblical story of Amalek, which is a explicit story of total destruction. Total destruction. It is a biblical story of genocide, right? When the Israelites are ordered to destroy all of Amalek, right? Not only did he, not retract this, but he doubled down in a special letter to soldiers and officers in the Israeli army a few days later, again referring to the biblical story of Amalek, which again is especially when you think about it in the annihilatory atmosphere that I mentioned in Israeli politics, society, and public spaces, proclamations by journalists, then this is meant to reinforce all of this for soldiers and officers in the army, and definitely constitutes, in my view, a proclamation of intent to destroy. There are others. I mean, there are other proclamations we know today, for example, that Israel has dropped more than 20 tons of explosives on Gaza. That is 1.5 times the Hiroshima atomic bomb, that the Americans dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. We know Human Rights Watch has documented and confirmed the use of white phosphorus bombs. I encourage your readers and listeners to check what white phosphorus bombs do. There's a reason that they're illegal, right? We know that the Israeli attack has killed now more than 11,000 Palestinians in Gaza and over 4,000 children and youth. That is more than children and youth who have been killed in conflicts around the world since 2019. This is all within a month, right? The numbers now are that Israel has killed more Palestinians within a month than the Russian attack in Ukraine has killed in almost 2 years. Now, I want to remind everyone that on April 2022, less than 2 months into Russia's attack on Ukraine, US President Biden already said, in his opinion, it wasn't the opinion of the US government, but in his opinion, that the Russian attack on Ukraine is a genocide, right? And he said, we'll let the lawyers decide, right, internationally, but it sure, and this I quote him directly, but it sure looks like this to me, right? So I think that we all see now that Gaza looks like, and worse actually than Ukrainian cities under Russian bombing and attack, right? And it definitely looks like, and it also fits, right, the international legal definition of genocide. We also have to be clear that more than half of the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed by Israeli bombings, by the Israeli attack, and that includes more than 220 schools, that includes dozens of mosques, several churches, about half of the hospitals in Gaza, if not more, right? So any pretense to targeted killings of Hamas militants or Hamas military installations in this reality, together with the proclamations of intent, cannot really be made, right? Nothing is targeted here. Now, if you add to this, and this is the last point that I'll make about this issue, but if you add to this the forced displacement of now more than 1.5 million people out of the 2.2 million people in Gaza, in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, right, which again reinforces the effect of the carpet bombings. But if you add to this the issue of displacement, and the Israeli order early on 13th of October, for all of the Palestinians in the northern part of Gaza to evacuate to the southern part of Gaza. It's 1.1 million people. So this forced displacement is happening in a situation that is also calculated to bring about the destruction of the group. Why? First of all, because we know, and it's well documented, that people fleeing to the south were bombed. While they were fleeing in routes that they understood, according to the messages that they received from the Israeli army, to be safe routes to flee, they were bombed on these routes, right? But even more than that, the total siege, back to the total siege. We know today that in the coming days, unless policies and measures change, Gaza may run out of food, right? We know today that people on average are surviving in Gaza on 2 pieces of bread a day, right? We know today that people on Gaza are surviving on 3 liters of water a day. The minimum required, according to the World Health Organization, is 100 liters of water a day, and that's for everything, for cooking, for drinking, of course, and for washing. 3 liters a day, right? Of course, you can't cook, for example, rice and lentil without water, right? So we're also, medical supplies are running out. The situation in the hospital under bombings is catastrophic. So we are absolutely seeing, right, dynamics of violence that, together with the proclamations of intent, there is no other way to look at it than indeed a textbook case of genocide.
Thanks, Raz. You make a really compelling case, and most who are watching this carefully will be convinced, of course. But we are seeing denial by a lot of the mainstream media, and it's one of the 2 things that's really surprised me across the board from the media and politicians. They are refusing to call it what it really is, when, as you mentioned, Biden himself was very quick to come out and describe what Russia was doing to Ukraine as genocide. So that's one of the things that's really shocked me, just the sheer denial of the scale of the violence. Biden himself was unwilling to accept the numbers that were coming out from Gaza. I found that extremely shocking, because the same people produced the numbers in previous conflicts. And after the conflict, there's consistency with the numbers that was provided by the Gaza Health Authority and various other international organizations. So there's no discrepancy previously. So now there's a discrepancy all of a sudden in the numbers as well. So there's a denial to accept the reality. And the other one is the sheer surprise and shock I feel over the proclamations from Israeli officials, from top to the top, from the upper echelons to the ministers to Israeli society, just the intent to commit genocide and without any consideration of the consequences. So I found those 2 things extremely shocking. Have you found that to be the case in your experience?
I mean, unfortunately, I can't say that I'm surprised by this at all. And there's a reason. There's a reason for that, and the reason is that Israel enjoys and has always enjoyed a state of impunity in international law. Now, there's a reason for the state of impunity. The reason is that the international legal system after World War II, that includes the Genocide Convention, that includes the discourse and practices and institutes of human rights, right? And then eventually, after, also includes the international courts, the International Criminal Court, and also the International Court of Justice, the UN system. This international legal, the system of international law, emerged from the Holocaust, and it emerged from the idea that the Holocaust was a unique and exceptional event. Now, we can go into a discussion of, why the idea that the Holocaust is unique and exceptional was and is so compelling in Western culture, right? But the fact is that this is the situation, that the idea that the Holocaust was and is unique became a dominant identity issue in Western culture, certainly in the last 3 decades, that is after the fall of the Soviet Union, and really the the full-fledged emergence of this international legal system. Now, why is this important? Because by implication, the Holocaust being unique or exceptional, Jews are perceived to be unique and exceptional. Now, because we're talking about Western culture and societies, that's also not surprising because, of course, we're talking about a Judeo-Christian world where Jews are, to begin with, have a special status. Now, they also had a special status in the eyes of the Nazis, for example, right? But a very negative and destructive special status. So this turns, of course, the special status on its head to make Jews now also a unique and exceptional people. And Israel, as the self-proclaimed Jewish state that emerged from the Holocaust, is also therefore unique and exceptional. So the idea that Israel might commit, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, right, became basically an impossibility, really unspeakable, actually, from the very beginning. The impunity is baked into the system, the international legal system, from the beginning. Now, this is why we have decades of evidence of violations of international law by Israel and decades of military occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, for example. 16-year-old siege on the Gaza Strip, which is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. Many, many other violations of international law by Israel. And no accountability, right? The investigation on the situation in Palestine in the ICC says 2014 has not moved forward, right? Why? Because it's not just impunity, it's structural and systemic. It's actually the basis of the international legal system. And that's why now we know that since World War II and also in the last 3 decades, there's a lot of mass violence and genocide around the world, right? This is not the first time that we know that the international legal system, right, is not actually working well. But now this is Israel. So now the pushback, because this is Israel, it's very clear to everyone involved that the system is shaking, right? This is not just a simple challenge to the system, it is shaking. The pushback to make sure that we don't talk about genocide, right, is and will be immense, right? Because everything will be done to keep the system in place. The system will not be able to be kept in place, right, if we talk about genocide, Israel's unfolding genocidal assault on Gaza, right? So I'm not surprised at all by this. It's really rooted in an element of Western identity, right? That is key to the international legal system. But I have to say, we are seeing unprecedented change. We've seen the UN General Secretary talk in the UN about the context of the Hamas attack on 7th of October, specifically mentioning 56 years of Israeli military occupation, right? This is unprecedented, especially when we think about the Hamas attack on 7th of October, right? Again, the General Secretary in no way justified or excused the attack. And there, as I said, there is no way of justifying or excusing this horrendous mass murder and war crime and crime against humanity. But if we don't put it in context and we don't think how we arrived where we are, we'll not be able to think where to go forward. And I think that now a lot of people in the UN, we also saw the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court arrive to the Gaza-Egyptian border, right? He was not able to enter, of course, but arrived at the border. And in the video of him talking at the border, there's a lot of things that he didn't say. And he's making an unbelievable effort to keep this in the frame of war crimes, right? And of course, first and foremost with Hamas war crimes, right? But I think that it's clear now that if you investigate, and he should investigate Hamas war crime, and he should issue arrest warrants about the Hamas mass murder on 7th of October, but if he does all that, then he should also investigate and issue arrest warrants at the very least for Israel war crimes, which are very clear, I think, in this case, right? But that's the reason that we saw the prosecutor arrive at the border. That's the reason for the General Secretary's words about context for the 7th of October Hamas massacre. That's the reason that we see people in the US State Department expressing unprecedented views. That's the reason that senior UN officials are expressing some unprecedented views. That's the reason that one of the largest protest movements in the last decades around the world now is using explicitly genocide, right, as its rallying cry. So I'm not surprised by the pushback. I'm not surprised by the denial of reality in front of our eyes, right? But I also think that there is an, in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, you started with the statements of 880 scholars, international legal experts, conflict studies scholars, Holocaust and genocide studies scholars, talking about the prospect of genocide. In Holocaust and genocide studies now, there is an earthquake, right? More and more scholars are realizing that business as usual in Holocaust and genocide studies as an academic field, this is not international legal experts, right? Business as usual cannot continue. Think about the name of the field, Holocaust and genocide studies. It is the hierarchy, right? It is this Western identity, right, in the name of the field, right? And there's overlap between the field and state institutes of memory like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the international legal system. So there's these kinds of overlap. People in the field today, also people who signed the statement, including some very, very important scholars who have shaped the field, including Israelis and Jews, right, understand that business as usual is not possible. So yes, there's a lot of denial, there's a lot of pushback. There will be a lot of political power behind the pushback and the denial, without a doubt, right? But there's also other currents and forces, right? So in the months and years ahead, we'll see where we go from this.
So looking months and years ahead, just on the question of accountability, here in the UK, there's a number of organizations. One is called the International Center for Justice for Palestinians, ICJP. So they've issued a number of letters to politicians and government officials, putting them under notice that they could be complicit in genocide. I'm sure something similar is happening in the US as well. I think there was a response from the White House today to a question about officials in Washington being prosecuted for complicity in genocide. Based on what you're saying, the field of genocide studies is shaking. There seems to be a door that's open to allow for a discussion about the nature of Israel's crime that's being committed. So do you think we will see a situation where civil society groups will be mobilizing to prosecute not just Israel, but of course officials here in the UK, in the US and Europe generally, who have, if not complicit, but they've stood on the sideline and watched genocide unfolding in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, if we recognize genocide, and it's very important to I think that the debate about whether what we're witnessing is genocide or not will continue for years, right? And I think that unfortunately, I think it is highly unlikely that there will be charges of genocide in this case because of everything that I've said, right? So I don't, yes, if we recognize that this is genocide, then governments who are supporting Israel in material ways by supplying arms, for example, are then complicit in genocide. And not only that, they're also not fulfilling their obligation, according to the UN Genocide Convention, of intervening to stop it, right? But again, all this, I fear, because of obvious reasons, because of international politics and political power, will not happen. I do think that there are issues of accountability, other issues of accountability that have more likely to happen. So there might be charges and arrest warrants against Israelis on charges of war crimes, maybe crimes against humanity. But in order to do that, you need to push the discussion about genocide, right? Because that's almost like a negotiation, right? Okay, so we won't talk about genocide, so let's talk about what's very, very obvious, right, in front of our eyes, war crimes. Because people need to understand, when Israeli army spokesmen appear on television and they say, we've told the people in a hospital in Gaza to evacuate, which is of course impossible. Anyone understands that evacuating thousands of people on life supports, pregnant women, people with disabilities, right? All this is impossible, right? But when they say Hamas is hiding in the hospital or under the hospital, right? So you need to evacuate because we're going to target that, because we're targeting Hamas, right? Even if Hamas is hiding in the hospital or under the hospital, targeting the hospital with people, with civilians inside, is still a war crime, right? So when Israeli army spokespeople appear on TV and say this in order to rationalize an attack, right, and say we're not targeting civilians, well, you are actually admitting, right, to an intent to commit war crimes, right? So in this kind of negotiation in the international legal system, it's very important to push the discussion about genocide, first and foremost, because this is what's happening, right? But also because in the international politics, and international law is international politics, right? There's this negotiation that can then bring it down, as it were. And this is very horrible to speak about it in this ways, but this is politics, right? To the obvious crimes here of war crimes and perhaps crimes against humanity. That's an issue of accountability that might happen, right? In various ways. There are other international legal processes that might come to fruition in regards to Israeli violations of international law, past and present, actually, right? In other ways, not only in the International Criminal Court, but in general, I think that regardless of how likely things are to happen, I think that this is a moment, and certainly as a scholar as a Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholar, as a Jewish Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholar, right? I think it's incredibly important, right, to insist on the importance of accountability, to insist on the importance of truth, right? What we're seeing in Gaza is actually not war, right? What we're seeing in Gaza should be discussed in the language of state violence, of mass violence, genocide or not, right? So we need to insist on issues of truth, on accountability, on justice, right? And I think that also more and more, you're asking me about, I talked about the, weeks, months, the years ahead, but we also, and scholars in the field, I think, and Holocaust and Genocide Studies are seeing this more and more, we should also be very mindful of the intensifying assault against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Horrific intensification of violence. Already 2023, by the way, was the most lethal year for Palestinians in the West Bank since 2005, right? After 7th of October, for example, 15 entire Palestinian communities have been uprooted and forcibly displaced. Thousands of Palestinians have been arrested in a horrific crackdown. We're seeing an intensification of basically ethnic cleansing in areas C, which comprise 60% of the occupied West Bank, that again has itself very much escalated since January 2023 with this new Israeli government that is the most far-right, nationalistic, explicitly fascist and settler government in Israel's history. So we have to be mindful about that, but we also have to be mindful about Israeli Palestinians and the danger that awaits them. And we're talking about a bit less than 2 million people, 20% of the state's citizens, who, I mean, there's a long history of viewing them as actually enemies since the military rule imposed on them after the 1948 war in the Nakba. Those 156,000 Palestinians who managed to survive and stay within what became the state of Israel. They were under military rule until 1966, so directly considered enemies. And then if we fast forward to the last few years, we have the Jewish nation state law in 2018 that directly relegates them to second-class citizens, right? And we have the May 2021 events in the context of yet another attack on Gaza, of course, and on Palestinians in Jerusalem, where there was a lot of violence and clashes between Jewish and Palestinian citizens, and a lot of violence against Palestinians by the Israeli police, but also by Jews on the streets. And in some cases, like in Haifa, Jews broke into Palestinians' homes and attacked them in their homes, right? So we have to be mindful that with every passing day, right, and especially in the context of a public space and media discourse and social media discourse in Israel that sees Palestinians as enemies, and that is spreading not only regarding Palestinians in Gaza, but basically Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians everywhere, right? This is very dangerous. As I said, we've seen in cases in genocide in the past, the Armenian genocide, the Rwanda genocide, other cases, the effects of treating a whole civilian populations as basically enemy targets in the context of a war with a dehumanizing discourse about them, right, which was very dominant in the case of Rwanda, for example. This is very, very, very dangerous. And as scholars of Holocaust and genocide studies, we have to be mindful of this. So this is not in the years ahead, this is in the weeks ahead. And, you know, the case of Rwanda, by the way, to finish with this, is actually very significant in another way, because we all remember that as Hutu state authorities, militia, and civilians killed more than 800,000 Tutsis within 3 months in 1994, the US government, US President then Bill Clinton and his administration were extremely busy in denying that what we were seeing in front of our eyes was actually what it was, that is genocide, right? They had no interest in intervening due to the loss of US Army soldiers in Somalia the previous year. And they knew that if it would be recognized as genocide by the US government, that would require, according to the convention, intervention to stop it. So they were very busy at telling everyone, right, that this is not genocide, what was clear to everyone that was happening in front of our eyes. I think this is also historically very instructive.
It is, and you've touched on a lot of things there. And one of the things that's worrying for me as well is the manner in which Netanyahu refers to Palestinian citizens of Israel. Bellicose language. He refers to them as another front in the war. Of course, Gaza is one front, West Bank is another front, and then the 2 million Palestinians, citizens of Israel, he refers to them as another front. So that's a very dangerous language, and we'll have to wait and see how that unfolds. I mean, I have so much to ask you, but we have run out of time. Hopefully we can continue this conversation, see how things evolve in the next weeks and months. And I want to thank you, Raz, for joining us, and thank our audience and viewers at home for joining us, and hope to see you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.